pleasure to introduce Lauren Aguirre. She is an award-winning science journalist with experience in multiple formats: documentaries, podcasts, short-form video series, interactive games, and blogs. She built her career at the PBS series Nova after graduating from MIT. Her reporting on memory has appeared in The Atlantic, Undark Magazine, and the Boston Globe Stat. The Memory Thief is her first book, and it is a terrific book. It would be unusual if anybody here hasn't been touched by memory diseases among their friends or family. Lauren's clear and thorough reporting on the medical detectives investigating causes and potential cures will leave you with a little more hope for the future. Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I also want to thank the Sloan Foundation program in the public understanding of science and technology. They helped support the writing of this book. And I want to thank neurologist Monroe Butler, who's joined us here tonight and will be in the audience to help answer questions. He was involved almost from the very beginning in looking into this strange new memory loss and trying to understand what caused it. So the story at the heart of my book is this medical mystery, this tragic injury that happens to only a small fraction of people who overdose on fentanyl. And what happens is that fentanyl zeroes in on this one small, very vulnerable piece of tissue called the hippocampus. And that's the memory center of the brain. And as a result of this damage, the people who overdose on fentanyl and have this happen to them, they come to in the hospital, let's say, and they can't remember anything new. So they'll say, "Mom, why am I here?" She'll say, "You overdosed." And 30 seconds later, the same question, "Mom, why am I here?" "You overdosed." The doctor walks into the room for the third time and the patient will introduce himself as if they've never met. So new memories just don't stick. But this is a story that illuminates many other stories, how medical science advances, the basic science of memory, and the quest for a treatment for Alzheimer's. So I'm going to divide my talk into 3 sections, and I'll break in between to allow for questions. And then, but now I will start at the beginning with a short reading from the book about the discovery of the first patient. On the first Friday of October, Barish leans forward in his chair and stares at the MRI scan on his monitor. He's looking at the brain of a young man admitted to the hospital last night, and the image is so strange and beautiful that he knows something has to be wrong. "Whoa," he says out loud to his empty office. "This is weird." Floating brightly against the darker background of the rest of the brain are 2 C-shaped structures tucked on either side of the central fluid-filled cavity. Together, they make up the hippocampus, the place that holds the keys to memory. And the intense glow is a distress signal from many millions of cells. Some mysterious, marauding force has laid waste to just this tiny region, leaving the rest of the brain unharmed. Barish looks out his door to the still, quiet waiting room up on the 7th floor at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center in Burlington, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. Then he looks back at the monitor. Last night's phone call from nearby Winchester Hospital requesting permission to transfer this patient suddenly makes more sense. The distraught 22-year-old had recently overdosed. He was dragging one leg and repeatedly asking his mother if he was dying. Winchester is a smaller hospital that handles routine emergencies, like a broken wrist or an appendicitis. But when patients with complex conditions or unexplained symptoms come in, the staff will often send them over to Leahy, a facility that has hundreds of specialists and more equipment. With a high-quality image in front of him, Barish can see what the Winchester staff could not, and it explains why the patient was acting strangely. In 10 years of medical training, Barish has reviewed thousands of scans, brains shrunken from Alzheimer's disease, brains dotted with tiny broken blood vessels, brains with tumors in different sizes, shapes, and locations. In every case, no matter what the damage looked like, it was pretty clear what was going on. But what Barish sees on the screen in front of him is strange and alien, belonging to no category he can imagine. It looks like someone took a page out of his medical school neuroanatomy textbook and deliberately highlighted the brain's memory center. He re-examines the MRI, scrolling up from the base of the skull through the familiar soft gray brain structures until the hippocampus comes back into view. It seems certain that this patient will fail the memory tests they'll give him today, and the damage has triggered Barish's interest in strange cases and rare brain diseases. He believes more in chance than in destiny, but still, he thinks, it's almost as if his years of study and obsession have guided him directly to this moment, sitting in this office, looking at this startling image. And now I'm going to share my screen and show you what that image looks like. So this is not Max's MRI scan. This is the scan of another patient whose story I follow in the book. This is the view. Imagine the patient lying on their back, looking up, and this is the view from the crown of the head down to the base of the skull, and those two squiggly bright things on either side are the hippocampus. And this is a view from the side with the person looking off to the left, and those that red thing there is also the hippocampus. So back to the story. So that was 2012 when Max Meehan came into the hospital, and really no one knew what to make of it. He was severely, what as they call it, amnestic. He couldn't remember anything for more than 30 seconds. And so he was sent home without a diagnosis, really. They didn't know what it was. And his memory was so poor that he had to drop out of college. He had to quit his job, and he moved home with his mother. But this was sort of a fluke, the kind of case that neurologists put in the back of their mind and say, I don't know what to make of that, and then move on. But a few years later, in early 2015, a construction worker from New Hampshire came into Leahy with his wife and his mother looking for answers. And they showed up in Jed Barish's office. And the man had stayed home alone on a weekend while his family went away. And when they came back, he was just like Max, asking the same questions over and over. And so 2 months later, he was no better, and they were looking for answers. So when Barish put this man's MRI scan into his computer and pulled it up on the monitor, it was like a time machine. It just looked exactly the same, that same strange characteristic damage to the hippocampus. So now the question was, what was the common link here? Because Max believed that he had overdosed on heroin. And this man, while he said he hadn't used heroin, he actually had a history of heroin use. So the connection appeared to be a heroin overdose, but people have been using heroin for many, many decades. And Barish didn't find examples of this through the literature of people using heroin and having this syndrome. So he thought, well, what's new here? What's changed? And what had changed was that in 2012, fentanyl had begun creeping into the drug supply in Massachusetts, and it was mixed in with heroin. So people were taking it unwittingly. And because, of course, it's much more potent, they were also overdosing more easily. So Barish then decided to see, could he find more cases? Because that's 2 patients. That's really not enough to know anything. That was just a hunch that he had. So he reached out to the CDC and asked if they could put out the call for more cases nationwide. And they came back with sort of alternate explanations that didn't make any sense to him and clearly didn't see the sense of urgency that he did. So he also went to the Department of Public Health and the state epidemiologist, Al DeMaria, who said, that's really interesting. If you can find a couple more cases, let me know and we can put the word out. So that's when Barish reached out to Monroe Butler, who was a resident at the time, and said, would you like to help? And fortunately, Butler said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. So together, he and a radiologist named Juan Small and another neurologist, Yuval Zabar, began to look through the records at Leahy to see if other patients had gone unrecognized, because this is a patient population that's kind of easily overlooked. They come into the hospital, they're confused, no one's surprised, and they're discharged. So by the fall of 2015, cases 3 and 4 appeared. And Barish went back to the DPH and they sent out an alert requesting that doctors let them know if they had seen a patient with this strange looking MRI, an amnesia, and an overdose. And within mere minutes of sending out that email alert, they began to hear back from people. And I will now show you the first case of the email that they got back. So this was from a neurologist, Chun Lim, at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. I was involved in such a case of a 49-year-old patient. He was found confused and amnestic, imaging with bilateral hippocampal injury and tox screen positive for opiates, which he denied taking. So this was one of the first cases, and Chun Lim has since seen other cases as well. So they got, over the next few weeks, about 25 reports like this, which they whittled down to 10 because many of them were missing information. So, but between the 10 and the 4 earlier, they were now up to 14. And you might be wondering now, like, this is a very tragic injury and it's really important for the people and their families to whom it happens to understand what's going on. But given the opioid crisis, is this sort of like caring about the arrangement of the deck chairs while the Titanic is going down? And one thing that Butler had pointed out to Barish early on was, you know, cases like this sometimes have the opportunity to reveal something new about how the brain works. And he pointed to another case of drug users who, in this case, they were in Northern California back in the 80s, had all taken the same batch of contaminated synthetic heroin. And very quickly, all of them developed symptoms of advanced Parkinson's. Well, that was a much easier problem to solve because they had all taken the same batch. They were able to isolate the toxin, and that toxin had zeroed in on another brain structure that is responsible for the symptoms of Parkinson's. So with that finding, they were able to, for the first time, make an animal model, a mouse model, that essentially got Parkinson's by being given this toxin. And that was their first way to then test new treatments for Parkinson's. So that was a huge breakthrough in that field and another motivation for really trying to sort out what exactly is causing this damage. But ironically enough, even though fentanyl was still considered the most likely suspect, there was actually still zero evidence for it because of all the 14 patients, none had tested positive for fentanyl. But as we've learned in the era of COVID, what's missing from the data is as important as what's in the data. And in fact, none of them had even been tested for fentanyl. And that's because hospitals don't routinely test for fentanyl. It's expensive. They have to send it out. And so you don't know what you don't know. So there were kind of 3 options in the playbook to try to see, are these people using fentanyl? So one was to go to the office of the chief medical examiner, because when someone dies from an overdose, that is the one place where they do routinely test for fentanyl. So Barish figured if any of those victims had also had an MRI scan and he could match up a positive fentanyl screen with an MRI scan with the same damage, that would give them a lot more information. But after discussing it with the chief medical examiner, they decided that was a research project that really wasn't appropriate. So he moved on. The next option was to keep searching through the literature online and seeing, was anyone else reporting cases like this, even if it wasn't fentanyl? And he did find one, and it was a doctor from West Virginia who had a patient with the same amnesia, overdose, same brain imaging, which he chalked up to stimulants. So Barish got in touch. He said, "Did you test for fentanyl?" The guy said no. Barish said, "Could you please, if you see another, test for fentanyl?" And not long after, another patient came in and he had taken fentanyl. But as is the case with many drug users, he had also taken a number of other drugs. So it still wasn't possible to say, is it fentanyl or is it not fentanyl? The third approach was to put out another call through the DPH, this time saying, if you see a patient, please report it. And if you can test for fentanyl, test for fentanyl. So within a few months, they had 4 patients who tested positive for fentanyl. 3 of them had also taken other things, but 1 had taken fentanyl alone. So that looked like the smoking gun, although there was still the possibility of a toxic contaminant. But not long after that, Barish heard about the case of a Canadian woman, a 63-year-old woman in Canada, who had used pharmaceutical grade fentanyl patches for severe pain control, which she was prescribed, and developed this syndrome. So I'm now going to try to share my screen. Oh, have I been sharing my screen the whole time? Okay. Can you see this now? Okay. So this is her journal entry. Feeling even more confused today, no sense of time, anxious, feel like I'm in a fog, 3:30, have to keep reading my journal and whiteboard to remember anything. Memory does not hold. So now I'm back. So this seemed to rule out a toxic contaminant, but still, they didn't have enough information to know exactly how is the hippocampus damaged and what exactly does the memory impairment look like, because most of the 14 patients had either passed away or disappeared. And then in early 2018, a young man who had used drugs from a very early age and also ironically had had a very bizarre relationship with memory for many, many years, where he had journaled like that woman and written lists for hours every day because he was afraid of losing his memory. So one day after about 18 months of sobriety, he got some bad news and went out and used fentanyl. And when he came to, he had the same syndrome and woke up with very, very severe amnesia. After about 4 months, he kind of emerged from his fog and found his way to Monroe Butler, and seeking to make some sort of meaning out of his tragedy, agreed to participate in research with Dr. Butler at the Memory and Aging Center at the University of California, San Francisco. And there they did a lot of really detailed testing, including an MRI scan that showed that he had lost 10% of the volume of his hippocampus, which is as much as a 60-year-old would lose in a decade, and that his episodic memory was on par, or his explicit memory was on par with that of someone with advanced Alzheimer's. But the rest of his brain was fine. Like, I played Scrabble with him, and while I had to remind him every single turn how many letters needed to be in the tray, he beat me hands down. So out of this very sad story, a number of interesting hypotheses have emerged. One, which I'd already mentioned, is can scientists make a new animal model for Alzheimer's based on the knowledge that opioids can damage the hippocampus? Another untested hypothesis is, is this sort of a spectrum of damage? And what about people who are taking opioids chronically long-term for ongoing pain, especially older people who are more vulnerable to memory impairments and who are prescribed opioids at higher rates? Is there some very subtle damage that's gone under the radar? And then the third is the knowledge that opioids can damage the hippocampus. Can we turn that on its head and say, and then protect memories and say, what about a sort of an anti-opioid? And there's a drug called naltrexone, which is used for people with opioid use disorders, that blocks the opioid receptors. So could giving a low dose of this help slow down memory loss? And so those are all questions that need to be investigated. It's really very much at the beginning, but it's only because of the diligent efforts of people like Jed Barish and Dr. Butler and many other neurologists who volunteered their time to work on this that those questions are even being asked. So I am just going to quickly share the screen one more time. I want to show you a journal entry. I opened the book actually with this young man, I call him Owen Rivers, with the scene of his overdose, and just to show you the state of mind, the journal entry from the night of his overdose. If nothing matters, we contrive meaning for ourselves. So why can't mine just be something that soothes me so that I can live here more peacefully? There are pressures from every direction saying that using drugs is unacceptable. And I understand most of them, but I still think that that's been the best solution for me so far. So Owen still has very significant memory problems, but I asked him and Butler and a few other people to write essays for the end of the book. And Owen wrote an absolutely beautiful essay about how he manages to make a life for himself now. So I recommend that you read that. And now we'll turn it over to questions for me or Dr. Butler.
I am not seeing any questions in the queue right now. I do have a question myself, which is that in the book, there is a lot of there's a lot of hard work that goes into trying to solve the mystery of what's going on with fentanyl in the hippocampus. And there's also a fair amount of luck, frankly, in terms of connections that get made between people. And, you know, this question is for you, Lauren, or Dr. Butler, which is like, how do you take the luck part out? Because it seems like it's almost like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but, you know, the pieces are scattered around the world, and just trying to, if the connections could be made more efficiently, one would get to solutions more quickly as well.
Well, I would say that luck favors the prepared mind. So there is a lot of luck for sure. And I think Barish and Butler were a great team because they each have like different areas of expertise that fit together. But yeah, I think there is no one kind of maneuvering from above and making sure that the right people talk to each other. It is serendipity.
Yeah, yeah. I have another question here, which is that, is the memory damage, so in the part of the presentation we're talking about the fentanyl damage to the hippocampus, is the memory damage permanent, or does it improve over time?
For some people it improves dramatically, and for some people it doesn't. And I think that's one of many mysteries as to why that is the case.
All right, this may be one you want to handle now or later. Your perspective on the new Alzheimer's drug that just got approved, that is so controversial in its approval.
That's for me?
Or
yeah, I'll take it, I guess. So you know what, I think let's save that for later, because it'll be easier to answer that after we've talked about Alzheimer's.
okay.
Yeah.
And you've got a couple of questions here about what got you interested, what got you, Lauren, as a writer, interested in pursuing this topic in the first place.
So I had my own brief moment with severe memory loss, which turned out to be a seizure. But I basically had like 2 minutes of not knowing who I was, not even my name. And that was really quite terrifying. And then serendipity again. One of the experts I went to for a second opinion on what to do, because surgery was recommended, was Jed Barish, who looked at my scan and said, "You're fine. This is not a big deal. You need to take medicine every day and you're going to be just fine." And he was right. So, so that experience really left me with a fascination for strange brains, and appreciation for how scary it is to lose your memory, and an understanding of Barish as a very sensible and practical person.
Okay. I will ask a slightly different version of the question to Dr. Butler, and that is, if you're still on the same thread of study that you were in the book, you're studying things for which there may not be good or totally effective cures available today. So what keeps you going? How you started down this path and you stayed on this path. So what keeps you going?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. When you're young in your career, sometimes you don't have the luxury of following interests. You get into a field where you know you have a space of interests, but you have to follow opportunity. And if you have had a chance to read the book, you might have seen that I was roped in kind of at the beginning in part because I was free labor and a free labor guy with curiosity. And I've been curious about the hippocampus for quite some time for many reasons. One of which doesn't take us far in the story from when it actually happened that I got involved. I was in a very bad car accident, really had never been a patient in my entire life. And then I became a junior doctor, was in a very bad car accident. And my last memory was being in an ICU, taking care of sick patients. My next memory was being in the ICU as a patient, waking up and pushing a button. And that button was to deliver opiates into my body because I had just undergone a surgery to repair my leg. And it was that experience where I realized the incredible addictive potential of opiates. And my curiosity about the brain and all of these processes really were brought out by this study. And so I saw firsthand the potential here. And I know there's assumptions we make about addiction when it comes to socioeconomics and class. And I think Lauren does an amazing job in this book to show us that this cuts across that. And so as someone who had gone through a traumatic event and then had a taste of what opiates can deliver in terms of pain relief, I was curious to understand more and to try and solve really why was it that this area of the brain was so vulnerable. So it's a bit personal and a little bit of always saying yes.
Okay, thank you. I think we're caught up on questions, Lauren.
Okay. So I now am going to laughably spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes on the science of memory. Obviously, that could take hours, but I definitely want to leave time to talk about Alzheimer's. So I'm going to focus on the biggest mystery of all in the science of memory, and I'll start with another short reading. Memory has 3 stages: encoding, storing, and retrieving. If any one of them fails, an episode from 3 days or 3 decades ago will be missing from your personal story. In an obscure natural experiment that began on an operating table 3/4 of a century ago, hints emerged that vanished memories could be found. Inside a turreted gray limestone building on a hilltop in Montreal, Dr. Wilder Graves Penfield gently lowers an electrode onto the glistening surface of the patient's right temporal lobe. She is a 32-year-old woman with severe epilepsy. Suddenly, she speaks. "I hear singing." Penfield lifts the electrode briefly, then lowers it again. "Yes, it is White Christmas," she says. Penfield waits for his assistant to place a small white paper square with the number 15 to mark the spot, before moving the tip of the electrode 1/4 of an inch away. That is different, a voice, talking, a man. Penfield lifts the electrode and the assistant marks the spot with a paper square numbered 16. Penfield discovers 8 locations that each evoke different auditory memories: a radio program, a play, a violin. 26 minutes after the patient hears the song White Christmas, Penfield returns to location 15 and lowers the electrode again. Again, she tells him the orchestra is playing White Christmas. So, as a result of this experience, Penfield believed that all memories are laid down and stored as if on film or tape immutably, and that they don't change. And he was wrong about that, but what he found was no fluke. And since then, other surgeons and epileptologists have found patients who also experience this sort of awakening or seeming awakening of memories during surgery. But this really does raise the big question, which is, what does a memory look like in the brain? What is the physical totality of a memory, the sights and sounds and smells? And a German zoologist in the 1920s gave this concept a name. He called it the engram. And his name was Richard Seaman, and he was very much ahead of his time. He did not have the technology to test his ideas, but he actually believed quite differently from Penfield that memories were stored in patterns distributed across the brain, and that they could interact with each other and contaminate each other, and that every time you remembered a memory, it changed. But again, he had no way to prove that. Another person to sort of take up the quest for the search for the engram was an American zoologist named Carl Lashley. And he went about it very methodically, working with rodents and snipping out bits of brain tissue, trying to get rid of the memory. But no matter where he snipped, he could never fully abolish the memory. So the memory seemed to be at once everywhere and nowhere. Now, with the modern tools of optogenetics, scientists have actually been able to find an engram, or at least a piece of a memory. So I'm going to share the screen again and show you what that looks like. So this is a very small slice of a very small piece of a mouse hippocampus, and the glowing green sort of teardrop things below the blue line and above the blue line, those are neurons that were tagged during the making of a memory with the sort of light switch, such that when you shine light on it again, those neurons come back to life, they get reactivated, and the memory gets reactivated. So neuroscientist Steve Ramirez at BU learned that by reawakening this memory, he could then introduce new information while that memory was sort of unstable. And then when the memory was consolidated again, he had changed the memory. So he had proved what we all know, when we talk to each other about our memories, that they're continually changing. And this knowledge that memories can change and be manipulated is actually something that potentially could point the way to treatments for other memory disorders or mental illnesses that feature memory problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety. And I will stop the share. And I think that in the interest of time, well, how are we doing? Maybe I'll just very quickly, I'll go back to our friend, the hippocampus. So you can't really give a talk about memory without showing this. So this is a picture of a rat hippocampus drawn by Santiago Ramon y Cajal in the early 1900s. And he didn't know what the hippocampus did. No one did at the time. One idea was that it was involved in processing emotion. But you can see how beautiful and detailed and intricate this structure is. And the way that scientists learned that the hippocampus is central to memory formation is another tragic story of a young man with epilepsy whose seizures could not be treated with drugs. And finally, they did a sort of experimental surgery on him, removed both of his hippocampi, because those tend to be a part of the brain that generates a lot of seizures. And they did really help his seizures, but he couldn't form a single new memory after that. His name was H.M. Henry Molissen, and he's probably one of the most studied patients in neuroscience. But that's how scientists learned about the role of the hippocampus. I think I'll just describe one more experiment because, it's obviously terrible to not be able to remember the past. But what scientists have learned is that you also need a hippocampus to imagine a future. So a neuroscientist in England named Lauren Aguirre did a classic experiment where she asked people with severe amnesia to imagine lying on a beach on a sunny day and tell me a story. And she asked people without memory problems, and they came up with all these interesting stories about a boat going past and the things they could hear and things they could smell. But the people with amnesia, it was very, very vague. It was like, there's white sand and there's blue sky. And she would say, can you see anything else? And they'd say, no, it's like I'm kind of floating. So that's sort of just to give you a taste of how devastating it is to lose memory, that it's not just about the past, but about your life story and imagining the future. So with that, I will turn it over to questions.
We do not have any questions at this time.
All right. Well, so we can move on to Alzheimer's and have more time for that. Okay. So what is Alzheimer's? It's there are many forms of dementia, but Alzheimer's is the most common one. It's a disease of aging. And not surprisingly, as long as I haven't put you all to sleep, by now it should not be surprising to hear that hippocampus is ground zero for Alzheimer's disease, or at least for most cases of Alzheimer's disease. And that's why memory loss is one of the first signs. But from there, the damage progresses outward and people begin to lose, have problems with speech and planning, and ultimately with mobility. And so today there are about 6.2 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's. Estimates are that by 2015, there will be about 13 million people with Alzheimer's. It will probably cost at least $2 trillion over the next decade. 1 in 3 people over the age of 85 have Alzheimer's. And we've known about Alzheimer's since the early 1900s, but as we all know, there is no cure or no treatment. So why has it been so hard to find a treatment? All brain diseases are hard, but Alzheimer's is particularly hard because it starts much, much earlier than the outward signs appear, decades earlier. So if you don't know how something begins or what the cause is, it's very hard to come up with a treatment. And of course, there may be more than one cause. But I will show you a picture of what we do know. So these are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease in the brain. So on the left, these are amyloid beta plaques. These are accumulations, toxic accumulations, sticky plaques of proteins that build up between neurons. And then on the right are these teardrop shaped things called tau tangles, and they build up inside neurons. But the spotlight for decades has been on these amyloid beta plaques. I'll stop the screen share now. And that makes sense for a lot of reasons, because some of the first clues to come out about Alzheimer's disease really revolved around amyloid beta. So, for example, the first 3 genes identified that cause familial Alzheimer's disease, which is very rare. I think it's about 1% of people who have that form of Alzheimer's disease. All 3 genes that cause it are involved in the processing of amyloid beta. Another clue is that people with Alzheimer's disease, if you do a PET scan, they have lots of accumulation of amyloid beta. And a third clue is that as scientists began to develop mouse models of Alzheimer's disease, they genetically engineered mice to churn out lots of this amyloid beta. Lo and behold, they developed these plaques and they developed memory problems. And then when scientists cleared the amyloid plaques, the mice got better. So it really stood to reason to think that clearing amyloid beta from the brains of people would work. Unfortunately, in 25 clinical trials over nearly 2 decades, it hasn't worked. And there are good reasons why it might not have worked. It's not to say that it doesn't work. It's just to say that there is no evidence that it works. And that could be partly because trials didn't used to be as well run. Sometimes the wrong people were in the trial. In a couple of studies, they found that 30% of the people in the trial, when they scanned them partway through, didn't even have amyloid beta. They didn't have Alzheimer's. So if you're looking for a treatment that's probably not going to have a huge effect, you're definitely not going to find it if you have people in your pool who don't have the disease. It's also very well known that you need to intervene early in this disease. So it's possible that many of these trials just didn't get people early enough. It's also possible that amyloid beta is not not the cause. It's possible that it's a symptom of something else that's gone wrong, or even an attempt by the brain to take care of a problem like infection. One neuroscientist, Alzheimer's researcher I spoke with said it's kind of like the fire department shows up because your smoke detector alarms have gone off, and they come in, they turn off the smoke alarms, and they leave, and the house is still on fire. So more recently, attention has turned to this other toxic protein, the tau tangles, which were there in the brain of the very first Alzheimer's patient, but have only recently come into the spotlight now. And the hope is that this might be a more fruitful path, because tau tangles build up first in the sort of gateway to the hippocampus, and then they move into the hippocampus. And then when they meet up with amyloid beta, which accumulates elsewhere in the brain first, then tau begins its destructive path through the brain. And where tau goes in the brain maps with the stages of Alzheimer's disease and the symptoms that people see. So this is an approach that's now in clinical trials. But, as I went around and talked to people, there was a lot of optimism, because people were really looking to take a lot of different shots on goals and a lot of different strategies, because Alzheimer's is a complicated disease. There are probably many pathways to intervene in. And so I cover a few other really interesting strategies in my book. One is possibly related to the amnestic syndrome, in the sense that it could be a similar phenomenon where people, older people, and especially people in the sort of memory loss stage that precedes Alzheimer's, have too much activity in the hippocampus. There's too much going on, and they have trouble forming memory. And this kind of hyperactivity can also release tau. So there's a clinical trial in progress right now with an off-the-shelf, very low dose version of an off-the-shelf epilepsy drug, to see if that can slow down memory loss. And no one right now is talking about a cure, but even slowing down memory loss by a few years would make a huge difference in the number of people suffering from Alzheimer's. Another strategy that I look at, which no one knows how it works, but it's kind of, if it works, it works, which is, it's called gamma entrainment. So gamma is one of a handful of brain rhythms in the brain. It oscillates 40 times a second. And in people with Alzheimer's, it's weaker. So the idea is to entrain those rhythms. Is anyone else hearing this feedback?
Yeah, a little grumpy.
Yeah, can people mute who are not currently speaking? Please put yourself on mute. Thank you.
So the idea is to entrain these brain rhythms non-invasively by exposing the person to flickering light or flickering sound at 40 hertz a second. And this was effective in mice, but as we know, we've cured Alzheimer's many times in mice and not yet in people. But this is another approach that's in clinical trials. And there are so many more. There are attempts to try to speed up the growth of new neurons, to figure out what are the resilience factors in people. Why do some people who seem to be at risk for Alzheimer's not develop Alzheimer's? What are the factors circulating in the blood, let's say after exercise, because we know that exercise is associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's. Is that something that could be put into a pill for people who can't exercise? Can we improve the brain's ability to clean itself up, which would be useful in many neurodegenerative diseases, because many of them feature an accumulation of some kind of bad protein. So people aren't talking about a cure, as I said, but they are saying, there's a renaissance in the field right now. And even if we don't have the answers yet, we can see how to get to the answers. And it might be 3 years, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. It depends who you ask. But they're all optimistic despite all the failures of the past. And I did ask one Alzheimer's researcher, I said, gosh, this seems like so depressing. How can you be an Alzheimer's researcher? And he said, no. Being an Alzheimer's researcher is actually an inherently optimistic choice, because it assumes that there's some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And if you keep on walking, you'll get there. So on that optimistic note, I will turn it over to questions.
We do have a question here, and that is, in terms of memory loss and Alzheimer's, is there a distinction between short and long-term memory loss?
I'm going to turn this question over to Monroe.
Okay. You'll need to, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. I guess let me make an assumption about this question, and if we need to clarify it, that's okay. By short and long term, if we mean long-term memories are memories from years ago, things we experienced in our childhood, things we experienced, say, in adolescence or young adulthood. In short term are memories that we're thinking of from last week. Did we go to Whole Foods? Did we go to Trader Joe's last week? If that's sort of what's behind this question, then for Alzheimer's, it really targets short-term memory. And the longer-term memories are relatively preserved. And that tells you something interesting about the way the brain works, which is, think of the hippocampus as a gate for recollection. And the word memory is great, but I really like the word recollection, a recollection. A collection of what? Well, it's a collection of perceptions. Well, what do we perceive? Well, we see, we hear, we smell, we touch, and we try to remember what touches us, like our emotional state. And so the hippocampus is this gate to take all of those things that we collect in, both from the external world and our internal world, and to put a stamp on it and say, this is important. You should remember this, and to put it into the larger structures of the brain to keep for long-term memory. So Alzheimer's hits that gateway. So you can't make those new recollections, but you might have those older ones, and you can pull them in. So any of us that have been touched by Alzheimer's from a family member know that this reminiscence of long-time memories, pictures from when someone was younger, even music, can be so powerful, and that those memories are very strong and still intact.
So with music in particular, because I think that's pretty well studied at this point, is that because of, is there something, there was something in Lauren's book about in the hippocampus, there's sort of a time place, there's sort of a time aspect and a place aspect. And there's almost like a choreography, if you will, to laying down memories and trying to like remember where different objects were in a room. So is that where the music connection is, that there's something about the pattern of music and that inherent repetition in music that makes it more memorable?
Yeah, great question. I have a few comments, but Lauren, go ahead.
No, you go for it.
Well, I'll retract my question.
No, great question. So when we say memory, it's an illuminating word and a little bit confusing because we're referring to a lot of things. And so when we talk about the memory of the way we move in the world, the things we've learned to do, things we could almost do with our eyes closed, like to pour the creamer into the coffee, to play, the piano like we did from years ago, is a part of the movements we have in the world. And movements are rhythmic. And if you make them rhythmic in a way that your brain learns them, we call it music. And so music is very powerful in disorders of memory because those memories are very much alive, much longer than those of brief little moments of what we saw or smelt for a second or touched. So I'll stop there, but maybe Lauren, you've got other thoughts after having researched this as well.
Oh yeah, my thought is that was a great answer.
Okay. Well, we
okay.
We have a different question here, and this goes to treatment. So Mary is asking about putting patients into ketosis is a treatment for epilepsy. Has either of you heard anything about that in your work and in talking to other researchers?
For Alzheimer's or for epilepsy?
It's just, they're saying putting the patients into ketosis is a treatment for epilepsy.
Yes.
So I think the question is there any bearing here on thinking about memory disorders like Alzheimer's?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just say, okay, great question. I don't want this to be any commentary about medical care, what might be best for someone's individual treatment. But let me take this question as an occasion to highlight what Lauren says in the book, is that the hippocampus, this small little structure, 1% of the weight of the entire larger structure of the brain, is this important gateway that is so vulnerable to seizures, to drugs, to stress, to dementia, to all of these things. And so it tells you it's a very important structure. And the way to keep it safe is not going to be the same for every condition. But it's why it made us so curious to try and solve this mystery, because we know how vital this structure is. And while it may be small by volume, it's large by impact.
And so I have a follow-up question, which is, I'm sure for many of the people on this meeting tonight, you get bombarded with messaging about ways to make your brain more resilient, and eat a Mediterranean diet and exercise more, and essentially anything that would otherwise be good for your vascular system is good for your brain. What is there to what are legitimate proven strategies that you might share with this audience that where you actually can do something proactively about the resilience of your brain?
Well, I will just say briefly, and then I'll let Monroe take it away. And I'm sure he's an expert, and I'm not. That basically anything you can do to protect your health helps your brain. And there is no prescription yet for the exact diet or the exact amount of exercise. They are working on a prescription for exercise. But there is evidence to say that if you use your brain to do hard things like learn new languages or how to play an instrument, that playing Sudoku over and over is not going to do it for you. If you're social, if you take care of your sleep, if you eat well, if you exercise, those things are associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's.
So it is that eat less
Yeah.
and exercise more thing.
There's a lot out there, and there are data to suggest what is beneficial, but I just want to be cautious and caution all of us to know that the impact of any of these behavioral changes is small, but it's important. And so there's very, very good evidence that moderate exertion exercise, even if you don't start habits until later in life, staves off the brain's decline. Eating a balanced diet. There's great data about this Mediterranean diet, but still there's data about the so-called DASH diet, right, for high blood pressure. And I want to mention this, it's a hard thing to study, but being social and engaged. And so it's not Sudoku, it's not chess, it's not calling a friend, but it's being embedded in a community of people. We know helps people to stave off decline. But if we just take a bigger picture view, we're not dying of tuberculosis when 1 in 4 Americans were dying of tuberculosis 250 years ago. And so we have new diseases now that we're living longer, and there's so much to learn. And so we're at the earliest stages here of how to stave off that decline, because we've never lived this long. And that's an exciting problem to have, but also an overwhelming one when we see how devastating it is to lose our brain's function as we age.
And what about COVID? Has there been any particular new, or have there been any particular new insights about brain function or things that harm the brain as a result of this whole constellation of COVID symptoms that people have experienced in the last year and a half?
Yeah, I want to keep us close to Lauren's incredible book here, and let's not miss that maybe a new mystery is going to emerge in the next few years. But I will just say this, I am pleasantly surprised how little I've heard of brain complications of COVID compared to how bad it could be, because viruses cause brain infections, very serious brain infections, and seizures and awful complications. And COVID has not done that in the majority of cases. So maybe we'll just kind of put that one to the side. It's good that COVID has not attacked the brain ostensibly, but we're going to find out in the next few years about the long-term consequences.
Okay. We did have the question earlier that we wanted to defer to the end about the new Alzheimer's drug, and I think even in your book you do touch on the payout, if you will, for scientists to pursue a particular course of inquiry is, whether or not others are willing to fund their research, right? You can have the most interesting idea in the world, but if you can't get that research funded, it's kind of like, where does it go? So, here comes this new Alzheimer's drug, which I have to assume a lot of work and study and research went into it. And it's quite controversial upon arrival. So I'm curious, Lauren, what your take is, and again, are there any particular insights from what you learned about research that might elucidate how did this thing show up to such controversy?
Well, there's someone I interviewed in the book who said, once one of these big pharmaceutical companies gets going, it's very hard to turn them around. I mean, they have invested a lot of money in it, and it is a controversial decision to approve it. And the FDA's own advisory panel recommended against it, and that's what the controversy really is at the heart of it. But no one is saying that it doesn't work. It's just that the advisory panel said the evidence isn't strong that it works in terms of improving memory function. The evidence is clear that it clears amyloid beta plaques, but whether that has a meaningful impact on people's cognition is the controversy. Obviously, everyone wants a drug for Alzheimer's, and everyone wants this drug to work. And I suppose that the time will tell. I have spoken with a few Alzheimer's researchers since who, said it's not going to stop all the other strategies. I'm sure pharmaceutical companies have multiple strategies. This isn't the amyloid cascade hypothesis, as it's called, is not the only one. So time will tell.
Here we go. We do have some new questions. So is there, Lauren, this is from Talitha. Do you feel an interest to follow the research and perhaps create another book as breakthroughs are achieved?
Well, breakthroughs take a long time, so I'm not holding my breath, but yes, I definitely hope there will be a second edition with interesting new things to say. There is a study that's almost certainly gotten funded by the NIH to look into this chronic long-term opioid use and if that's a problem. I know Barish is talking to people about trying to get a naltrexone study going. So, and there's an anesthesiologist at Mass General who's interested in working on this. So, it really is just at the beginning, and science takes a very long time. It was definitely a challenge writing this book as it was happening and as no one knew where it would go. And so obviously the story doesn't have an ending, but I don't think any story in science does have an ending. So this one really embraced the messiness of that and the lack of a clear ending.
Another question here is, did you come across any discussion of brain infections with spirochetes and Alzheimer's disease while you were working on the book?
I did not, but Monroe might have heard of that.
Interesting question. Spirochetes You see the start of the word spiro, it kind of makes you think spiral. Spirochetes are a type of bacteria that have a spiral shape, and they cause a lot of infections, some infections that go to the brain. The most famous of which was the #1 cause of dementia for centuries. We could poll the audience, but the answer is syphilis. Now, in the 1950s, penicillin fixed society of this major #1 cause. And so overlapping with that is the identification by Dr. Alzheimer of Alzheimer's disease in the early 20th century. So the question here is there anything about this type of a bacteria, not necessarily syphilis, but something in that category that might relate to Alzheimer's? I don't think that was the focus in the book. I don't think there's a lot of evidence there to worry about. But a question is outstanding about Alzheimer's, which is why? Why does it happen? Why does it happen as we get older? Why does it happen to certain people? And of course, there are very simple genetic causes, as Lauren said, in a small number of cases. But what about the rest of us, the millions and millions? That's still unknown. And we know the risk factors, but we really don't know the true cause. So this is a great question, but we don't have a slam dunk answer in that space. So I wouldn't be too worried.
Okay. And Lauren, when there's a lot in the book about fentanyl and fentanyl, being an agent that can cause damage to the hippocampus. So I'm curious, given how ubiquitous fentanyl is as an anesthetic, is this research leading to any different kind of thinking about other people who shouldn't get fentanyl for surgery or for pain medication? So
Yeah, so that really has not been studied, which is an opportunity opened up by this. I actually wrote an article about that a few years ago, and because some people do after surgery have memory problems, and for most people it resolves quickly. For some people it lasts for months, and for a tiny percentage of people it continues for a long time. So anesthesiologists have looked at a bunch of different drugs, because up to 10 are given during surgery, before, during, or after. But no one that I found, and I asked a lot of people, had looked at fentanyl. So that is one thing to come out of it, is to, again, look at fentanyl as a model for memory loss. And it is a good question that should probably be asked. Is fentanyl something that we should be looking at carefully? It's clearly not a huge problem, because 80 to 90% of surgeries involve fentanyl, and we don't have all these people walking around with memory loss. But and partly that's because it's given with another drug that would counteract the excitotoxic effect of fentanyl. But are there a tiny percentage of people, and that's what we're talking about in a lot of these cases, is vulnerabilities.
mm-hmm.
Are there some people who are vulnerable to damage from fentanyl?
Okay, thank you. Do we have any final questions for Lauren? I'm not seeing any new questions here. You can speak now or forever hold your peace. I'm gonna wrap things up, I think. I would strongly encourage everybody here tonight to read Lauren's book. There is a lot of great information, scientific information in there that really is presented for a lay audience. So, don't worry if you're not an MD or a neurobiologist. It really reads like a detective story, and with a lot of interesting people and research, and a lot of it is very close to home for us here in the Boston area. I want to thank Lauren and Dr. Butler so much for joining us here in Salem virtually this evening. And I will thank our audience for coming this evening, and encourage you to follow our newsletter, follow us on social media, and keep abreast of what's coming next on our calendar.